He lived far from town, in a small wooden house that stood between the trees and the river. Most people in the nearby village barely knew his name. They saw him sometimes when he came down for supplies, quiet and polite, never staying long enough for small talk. To them, he was just another man who wanted peace and privacy. No one guessed that he had once led men through the most dangerous corners of the world. His days were simple now. He woke up before the sun, brewed a pot of black coffee, and stepped out to the porch with his dog, a big Belgian Malinois named Rex. The dog would sit beside him, alert yet calm, eyes scanning the woods as if guarding something precious. They shared a quiet understanding. Neither spoke, but both seemed to know what the other was thinking. Mark, though only a few people knew his name, had spent nearly 20 years in special operations. The kind of missions he'd led were the kind people never read about in the papers. He had traveled through deserts, jungles, and war-torn cities. He had seen things most men couldn't forget. When he finally retired, he didn't celebrate or feel free. He only felt tired of noise, of orders, of the endless tension that never left his bones. Rex had been his partner in those years. The dog was trained for everything: tracking, search, rescue, even detection. But more than that, Rex had been family. During long nights overseas, when fear or loss threatened to take over, Rex's calm eyes reminded Mark that he wasn't completely alone. They had survived together, and when the time came to leave the service, Mark made sure Rex came home with him. Life in the woods gave them both space to breathe. Mark bought the old cabin with his savings. It had no neighbors close by, only a small dirt road that led to town. He fixed the broken roof, painted the walls, and turned the spare room into a small workshop where he carved wood. At first, his hands still shook from old memories, but the rhythm of carving helped steady them. Every morning he took Rex on long walks through the forest. The sound of birds, the smell of pine, and the crunch of leaves underfoot became their new routine. Sometimes they would sit by the river for hours, watching sunlight dance on the water. It was a simple life, but it felt honest. Despite his calm appearance, Mark carried ghosts. Sometimes, when thunder rolled over the hills, his heart would race as if he were still in a war zone. Loud noises made him tense. He had learned to control it, but not erase it. He spoke little about his past. To the few locals who saw him, he was just the quiet man with the big dog. Rex, however, was known by everyone. The dog had a friendly way of wagging his tail when they passed through town. Children pointed at him with wide eyes, and Mark would sometimes let them pet Rex, who would sit still, patient and gentle. The shopkeeper at the small grocery store always kept a biscuit ready behind the counter. "Your friend's a good boy," the shopkeeper often said. Mark would smile faintly and nod. "He's the best there is." The days turned into seasons. In winter, the snow would cover the trees, and Mark would chop firewood while Rex trotted behind him, leaving small prints in the white ground. In spring, the forest bloomed again, and they would hike up to the ridge where wildflowers painted the hill in color. Mark had never thought peace could feel so ordinary, and yet that was exactly what he needed. Sometimes at night he sat by the fire with an old photo album. The pictures were faded: men in uniform, helicopters, dusty roads. He rarely looked at his own face in them. Instead, his eyes always landed on Rex, younger and leaner, wearing a vest and looking straight at the camera. The dog hadn't changed much, except for a few gray hairs now around his muzzle. "You're still the same old soldier," Mark would whisper, patting his head. Rex would thump his tail once, as if agreeing. The locals had many stories about him, none true. Some said he had been a police officer who lost his family. Others said he used to be a forest ranger. Mark never corrected them. Letting people believe what they wanted was easier. The truth was something he had locked away, a life he had chosen to leave behind. There was a small coffee shop at the edge of town where he sometimes stopped on rainy afternoons. He would sit near the window with Rex resting at his feet, sipping coffee and reading the paper. A few regulars would nod politely, but nobody asked questions. That was one of the reasons he liked the place. Nobody pried. He didn't have many friends, but he didn't feel lonely. The woods were company enough, and Rex filled the silence better than words could. Occasionally, he'd get letters from old teammates now scattered around the country. Some were doing security work. Others were training recruits. They all wrote in the same tone, short, careful, always ending with, "Stay safe, brother." Mark kept those letters in a drawer, but rarely replied. It wasn't that he didn't care. He just didn't know what to say anymore. His life had shrunk to something smaller, quieter, and that was how he liked it. Still, there were moments when the past crept back. A low-flying helicopter would make him freeze. The distant crack of a gunshot during hunting season would twist his stomach. At times like these, Rex would nudge his hand, grounding him again. That dog seemed to understand things no one else could. Rex was trained to obey commands, but after years together, they hardly needed them. A simple glance or hand signal was enough. When they walked through the forest, Rex stayed a few steps ahead, alert but relaxed. If a stranger came near, his posture changed subtly, protective but not aggressive. Mark trusted that instinct completely. Once a group of teenagers had wandered near his property, laughing loudly and throwing rocks into the river. Rex barked once, deep and firm, and the kids froze. Mark called him back immediately, and the dog obeyed, tail wagging slightly. He didn't like scaring anyone, but he also valued his privacy. After that day, the locals learned to respect the quiet man's space. They waved from a distance but rarely came close. It suited Mark fine. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was just done chasing it. When evenings came, he would sit on his porch with a book or his guitar. He wasn't much of a player, but he liked the soft sound filling the air as the sun went down. Rex often lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. Sometimes the dog would lift his head and look toward the woods, ears twitching at some distant sound. Mark would glance up too, both listening, both still. It was a peaceful rhythm. Until the night, everything began to change. It started with small things. Strange cars slowing near his driveway, flashlights flickering in the distance. Mark noticed but said nothing. He knew curiosity when he saw it. The local police had been patrolling more often after reports of break-ins around the county. Still, he had nothing to hide. One afternoon, he drove into town for groceries. At the store, he overheard two officers talking near the counter. "Heard there's a guy living out past the river," one said. "Doesn't mix with anyone. Always keeps that big dog with him." "Yeah, maybe that's our guy," the other replied. "Could be hiding something." Mark didn't say a word. He paid for his groceries and left quietly. Rex was waiting in the truck, tail thumping as always. On the drive back, Mark's mind wandered. He had no interest in trouble, but he also knew how quickly assumptions could turn dangerous. That evening, he walked a little farther than usual. The forest was calm, the air cool and fresh. Rex bounded ahead, chasing a stick Mark threw into the river. Watching the dog splash through the water, he smiled for the first time that day. "Good boy," he called softly. Rex barked once and came trotting back, dripping wet and happy. Back at the cabin, the sun dipped low behind the trees, painting everything gold. Mark lit a small fire outside and cooked dinner over it. Simple food, but it tasted better out here. Rex sat nearby, eyes fixed on every movement, waiting for a piece of meat. After eating, Mark leaned back in his chair, watching the last light fade. A feeling of contentment settled over him. The quiet life he had built felt safe, earned, and real. He didn't know that within a few days, all of it would be tested in ways he could never imagine. For now, though, the night was still. The wind rustled softly through the trees. Rex yawned and stretched out beside his chair. Mark reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You've done good, partner," he murmured. "We both have." The dog gave a soft sigh, tail brushing against the porch floor. Mark sat there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the forest, the distant call of an owl, the river's gentle flow. The kind of sounds that used to feel foreign now felt like home. It had taken him years to get here, to find a place where the noise of the past finally faded. But deep down, he knew peace was fragile. He knew how easily calm could shatter. Maybe that was why he held moments like these so close, as if memorizing them for a time when he might need the memory to stay strong. When he finally went inside, Rex followed close behind, as always. The cabin lights glowed warm against the darkness. Mark closed the door, checked the locks out of habit, and glanced once more at his companion. "Another day done," he said softly. Rex wagged his tail and curled up on the rug. Mark smiled faintly and turned off the lamp. The forest outside went silent again. In that quiet, the man who had once led battles across the world drifted to sleep. Not as a soldier, but as someone finally at peace, unaware of the storm waiting just beyond the edge of the woods. The days after that quiet evening passed without much change. The forest stayed calm, the river whispered the same song, and the man went about his simple routine, Yet something in the air had shifted just slightly, like a storm still far beyond the horizon but slowly moving closer. He woke early as always, brewed his coffee and sat on the porch while his dog rested beside him. The morning sun peeked through the trees, turning the mist gold. It was peaceful, but Mark, though he didn't show it, felt a faint unease he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the cars he'd seen near the dirt road again, or maybe it was just his old instincts stirring. After years of living with danger, the body sometimes noticed what the mind refused to believe. That week, news spread around the small town that there had been more break-ins in the area. Someone had stolen tools and equipment from a nearby construction site. The police were stretched thin and people were nervous. The rumors grew wilder with each day. Could be someone camping out in the woods, one man at the store said. Maybe. That quiet guy by the river knows something, another replied. Mark didn't pay much attention to gossip. He had no reason to think the situation had anything to do with him. He minded his own business and assumed others would do the same. But the world doesn't always work the way we expect. A few nights later, he sat by the fireplace reading an old book while Rex lay near his feet, head resting on his paws. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees. It was close to midnight when Rex's ears twitched. The dog lifted his head, alert. "What is it, boy?" Mark asked softly, setting his book down. Rex stood and moved to the window, staring into the dark. Mark joined him and peered outside. There was nothing visible but shadows and the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. Still, Rex didn't relax. His posture was stiff, watchful. Mark trusted that instinct completely. He turned off the lamp, stepped outside quietly, and listened. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the forest, then faintly the crunch of gravel on the road. Probably just someone driving by, he thought. Still, he stayed outside until the sound faded. Then he went back in, gave Rex a pat, and said, "All clear. Go on. Get some rest?" Rex settled down again, but the man didn't fall asleep easily that night. Something in his gut told him that the quiet wouldn't last. The next morning, he drove into town to pick up supplies. At the small cafe, he overheard two locals talking with a police officer near the counter. "Yeah, folks say someone's been living off the grid near the river," one said. "Strange fella. Keeps to himself," the officer nodded. "We'll check it out." Could be nothing, but better safe than sorry. Mark didn't react. He paid for his groceries, gave the cashier a polite nod, and left. But as he walked back to his truck, he couldn't help but feel the weight of those words. It wasn't fear, just the quiet frustration of being misunderstood. On the way home, he tried to shake it off. People often feared what they didn't understand. He had chosen a life of solitude. That choice came with misunderstandings. Later that afternoon, the sky turned gray with clouds. The wind grew stronger. Mark gathered firewood while Rex trotted behind him, nose twitching at every scent. The storm rolled in by evening, rain tapping on the roof like a steady drumbeat. Inside, Mark lit a fire and made tea. He sat by the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass. Rex rested nearby, occasionally lifting his head at a sound outside. It was a quiet night, until headlights flashed briefly at the edge of the woods. Mark frowned. Hardly anyone drove this way during storms. The lights lingered, then disappeared. He stood up but decided not to investigate. There was no reason for trouble. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the world damp and shining. Mark took Rex for their usual walk down the dirt path to the river. Birds chirped again, the smell of wet soil filling the air. For a while, everything seemed back to normal. But down the road near the edge of the property, he noticed tire tracks, fresh ones. Someone had stopped there recently. He crouched down, studying the marks. 2 vehicles by the look of it. Probably police patrols, he thought. Maybe checking for signs of the thief. He didn't mind that. They were just doing their jobs. Still, something about it made him uneasy. Rex sniffed around the area, tail stiff but not raised. "Let's go, boy," Mark said quietly. "Nothing for us here." They returned to the cabin and Mark tried to brush it off. He spent the rest of the day repairing a broken fence and fixing a leaky pipe under the sink. The routine work helped calm his thoughts, but that night the unease returned. He was sitting on the porch under the dim light, sipping his coffee, when Rex suddenly lifted his head and growled low. The man looked up sharply. Through the trees, faint beams of light flickered again. Flashlights, moving slowly. Probably just officers checking the woods, he murmured, more to himself than to Rex. Still, He stood up and walked a few steps forward, peering through the trees. Two figures moved near the edge of the property line. He could barely see their outlines, but he recognized the reflective patches on their jackets. He called out calmly, "Evening. Can I help you folks with something?" The lights froze, then one of the voices replied, "Sheriff's Department. Just checking around the area. You live here?" "That's right," Mark answered, stepping a bit closer but keeping his distance. "Anything wrong?" "Just a routine check. We've had reports of suspicious activity," one of them said. "Well, you won't find much here except me and my dog," Mark replied, voice polite but firm. They exchanged a few more words and then the officers nodded and left. It seemed simple enough, yet the man couldn't shake a strange feeling afterward. Something about their tone felt off, as if they hadn't entirely believed him. The next 2 days passed quietly, but that calm was only temporary. Late one afternoon, Mark was working in the shed behind the cabin when Rex began barking. It wasn't the playful bark of excitement. It was sharp, alert, the kind that came from instinct. Mark dropped his tools and stepped outside. 2 police vehicles were parked near his gate. A few officers stood nearby, scanning the property. Mark wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward them slowly. Rex trotted beside him but stayed close, tail stiff. One of the officers, a younger man with nervous energy, raised a hand. "Sir, we're following up on reports. There's been some theft in the area, and a description matched this location." Mark frowned slightly but kept his voice calm. "You're mistaken, officer. I live here alone. Haven't seen anyone suspicious." As they spoke, Rex stood quietly but watchfully, ears perked. One of the other officers glanced at the dog, uneasy. "Is he friendly?" the officer asked. "He's trained," Mark said simply. "He won't bother you unless you give him a reason." The tension in the air was small but noticeable. The conversation stayed polite, though both sides seemed cautious. Eventually, the officers thanked him and left again, leaving dust rising behind their cars. After they were gone, Mark stood by the gate for a long time, thinking. It was strange how quickly suspicion could fall on someone who simply kept to himself. He looked down at Rex, who stared back with trusting eyes. "People see what they want to see," he muttered softly. That evening, he made dinner and tried to let it go. The forest was quiet again, and the stars came out clear and bright. For a while, he almost forgot about the strange visits. But far away in the small police station on the edge of town, a report was filed. Someone had claimed to see a man with a large dog acting suspiciously, near the area where stolen equipment had been found. The officers who had visited Mark's cabin had mentioned meeting him, but they hadn't noted that he was a retired soldier. They didn't know. They saw only what was on the surface, a quiet man in the woods with a guarded attitude. The next call came 2 days later, and that's when everything began to unravel. It was a warm evening. Mark had just finished dinner and was sitting on the porch, watching the sun sink below the trees. Rex lay beside him, half asleep. The world felt still again, almost peaceful. Then in the distance he heard the faint hum of engines, 2 cars, maybe 3, coming up the dirt road fast. He looked up, puzzled. Visitors were rare. Rex stood alert. The sound grew louder. Headlights cut through the trees, brighter and closer. Mark rose from his chair, heart steady but cautious. Something wasn't right. Before he could say anything, the cars stopped near the gate, doors opening in quick motion. Voices echoed, firm, hurried, official. It was the police again. Rex barked once, sharp and loud. "Easy, boy," Mark said quickly, keeping his tone calm. He stepped forward, raising a hand. "Evening, officers." "What's going on?" The answer didn't come right away. The air was thick with misunderstanding, and though he didn't yet know it, this moment would change everything that followed. He looked down at Rex, who stood tall beside him, eyes focused but steady. The dog trusted him completely, and in that trust was something pure and unbreakable. For a long heartbeat, the world stood still, just a man and his loyal companion waiting in the golden light of dusk, unaware that fate had already turned its hand. The evening light faded slowly, and the sound of car doors closing echoed faintly through the trees. The man stood still, watching the officers move near his gate. He didn't raise his voice or step forward quickly. Years of discipline had taught him that calmness was strength. His dog stayed beside him, alert but quiet, eyes locked on the strangers approaching. He spoke first, trying to ease whatever tension hung in the air. "Is there something wrong, officers?" One of them answered, "We just need to ask a few questions. There's been another break-in nearby, and some people said they saw a man walking through the woods around here." Mark nodded slowly. "That may have been me. I walk my dog here every day, but I haven't seen anyone suspicious." The officer's tone stayed polite but distant. "We just want to take a look around, sir. Standard procedure." Mark hesitated for a moment, then said, "Of course, you're welcome to check around the property, but please don't startle the dog. He's trained, but he doesn't like surprises." They agreed, and for the next few minutes the officers moved carefully around the area, shining flashlights through the trees and peering near the shed. Mark stayed near the porch, arms folded loosely. He didn't feel angry, only uneasy. He understood they were just doing their jobs. But something about their approach didn't feel right. Rex watched them the whole time, every muscle poised but still. When the officers finally came back, one of them shrugged. "Looks clear," he said to his partner. Then turning to Mark, he added, "Sorry for the trouble. People get nervous after a few break-ins. We just had to be sure." "It's all right," Mark said simply. "I get it." They exchanged brief nods and left, their cars disappearing down the road. The forest soon went quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But Mark stood there for a long time, the sound of their engines fading in the distance. He knew something wasn't finished. He went inside and sat by the table, his thoughts heavy. He wasn't angry about being questioned. What bothered him was how easily people could misunderstand someone they didn't know. Rex came and sat beside him, resting his head on his knee. Mark reached down and rubbed behind his ears. "We didn't do anything wrong, boy," he murmured. "But it feels like we're being watched, doesn't it?" The dog blinked slowly, as if agreeing. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The man lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of insects outside. Memories he thought he had buried began to surface. Old missions, long nights, the weight of responsibility that never truly left. He remembered times when one wrong move could change everything, and now, in this quiet life, that same sense of tension had returned in a different form. He had walked away from a world built on suspicion, yet it had somehow found him again. The next morning, the forest was calm as always, but Mark's mind wasn't. He decided to drive into town and speak directly with the local sheriff. Maybe a simple conversation could clear the air. At the station, the sheriff, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, listened patiently as Mark explained who he was and why he lived out there alone. "I'm not looking for trouble," Mark said quietly. "I just want to live in peace. I understand you have to do your job, but I hope we can avoid misunderstandings." The sheriff nodded. "I appreciate you coming in. Some folks around here don't like mysteries, that's all. They see a quiet man with a big dog and they start guessing things. I'll make sure my team knows you're not part of this." Mark thanked him and left, feeling slightly better. The sheriff seemed decent and fair. Maybe things would finally settle down. For the next few days, life returned to normal. The sun rose early, the river shimmered, and the man and his dog resumed their walks. Rex chased sticks through the tall grass, barking happily. It felt good to breathe again, to let go of the tension that had built up. But the peace didn't last long. A week later, a news story broke about the thefts. The local paper printed vague details and mentioned an unknown man spotted in the forest. Though no names were given, the description matched him almost perfectly. When Mark read the article, he sighed. "Here we go again," he muttered. He didn't blame the media entirely. They didn't know the truth. Still, it hurt to see how quickly rumors could paint someone as suspicious. Later that evening, he went into town for supplies. At the store, he could feel eyes following him. People whispered quietly, though they pretended not to. A few regulars greeted him, but their tone felt different. Less friendly, more cautious. He said little, paid for his groceries, and left. Outside, he paused by the truck, taking a slow breath. He had faced far worse situations before, yet this one felt heavier. It wasn't about danger, it was about being misunderstood. After all he had done for his country, now he was treated like a stranger who didn't belong. Back home, he sat by the porch again, watching Rex run in the fading light. The dog's joy never changed, no matter what people said or thought. Maybe that was why Mark valued him so deeply. Rex saw the world as it was, not through fear or judgment. But something inside the man had begun to shift. The calmness that once came easily now took effort. He found himself double-checking the locks, glancing down the road more often. The trust he had quietly built with the world was slowly fading. One afternoon, as he worked in his shed, he noticed tire marks again near the gate, fresh ones, heavier than before. Someone had been there recently. He looked around but saw no one. Rex sniffed the ground, then looked up uneasy. "Yeah," Mark said quietly. "I smell it too." He didn't like where things were heading. That evening he pulled out an old metal box from the closet. Inside were a few mementos, military patches, photos, letters from long ago. He hadn't touched them in years. Among them was a folded paper, his service record. The words on it reminded him of who he used to be and what he had once stood for. He stared at it for a long time, lost in thought. Then he put everything back, closed the box, and returned it to its place. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone, he thought. Still, a part of him knew that his past might soon become his only shield. Days later, 2 officers returned, not the same ones as before. They came in the late afternoon when sunlight poured through the trees. This time their tone was different. "Sir, we need to ask you again about the break-ins," one said. "We found some tire tracks nearby that match yours." Mark kept his voice calm. "I drive to town once or twice a week. The road's public. You're welcome to see my vehicle. It hasn't moved anywhere else." They inspected the truck and found nothing suspicious. Still, they took notes and left without much explanation. The whole exchange left a sour feeling in his stomach. After they were gone, Mark sat on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, staring into the distance. Rex came and sat beside him. "You'd think after all this time, people would learn to ask before they judge," he said softly. The dog leaned against his leg, offering silent comfort. That night, rain began to fall again. The sound against the roof was steady and familiar, yet it didn't soothe him the way it used to. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, something that would soon test the fragile peace he had built. As the days passed, Mark noticed more patrols near the area. Sometimes lights flashed briefly through the trees at night. He didn't interfere, didn't argue, but he made notes, license plates, times, patterns. Old habits returned naturally. Observation had once been his greatest skill, and though he wished to forget that part of himself, he couldn't. It was on one of those nights, while sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, that he made a quiet decision. If people were going to judge him without knowing the truth, then he would make sure they at least knew the full story. The next morning, he called the sheriff's office again. "I'd like to speak to you in person," he said calmly. When they met, Mark handed over a few documents, his service record, his honorable discharge papers, and a letter of recognition from his commanding officer. The sheriff looked through them silently. "I'm not showing these to prove anything," Mark said. "I just don't want more misunderstandings. I've worked my whole life to protect people. I shouldn't have to defend myself from the ones I swore to protect." The sheriff exhaled slowly. "I understand," he said. "I'll make sure the department knows. This should have been cleared up long ago." Mark nodded and left. On the drive home, he felt a small weight lift from his chest. Maybe this time things would truly settle. But deep down, a quieter voice whispered that it wasn't over yet. That evening, the forest was still again. The sunset spilled golden light across the trees. Mark sat on the porch, Rex by his side. The air smelled of pine and river water. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to relax. "You've done good, old friend," he said softly. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Rex looked up at him, eyes warm and trusting. The bond between them felt unbreakable. Something built not just through years of service, but through shared silence, shared peace. As the sky darkened, a faint sound echoed from far away, the low hum of an engine, familiar yet distant. Mark listened, heart steady. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched the line where the trees met the horizon. Change was coming again. He could feel it, quiet and certain. But this time he wasn't afraid. He had already faced the hardest battles life could offer. Whatever was waiting, he would meet it with the same calm he had always carried. For now, the world was still. The man and his dog sat side by side in the fading light, unaware that the next turn of fate would test not their strength, but their hearts. The next few days passed quietly, or at least they seemed to. On the surface, life had returned to normal again. The man went about his usual routines, fixing small things around the cabin, walking his dog along the river and keeping his mind busy. But inside there was a restlessness he couldn't ignore. Something about the way things had unfolded left him uneasy, as if he were being watched from a distance. He told himself not to overthink it. The sheriff had promised to clear things up, and that should have been enough. Still, habits built over a lifetime didn't fade overnight. Years of discipline had trained him to notice every detail. The way tire tracks changed direction, the faint sound of movement in the woods, the slight echo of footsteps where none should be. Rex noticed it too. The dog was calm but more alert lately, ears twitching at sounds that didn't belong. He had always trusted his instincts, and Mark had always trusted his. It was early one morning when a letter arrived in his mailbox, an unusual event in itself. He rarely received mail. The envelope was plain, no return address, just his name written neatly across the front. Inside was a short note, "Thank you for your service." Not everyone forgets, there was no signature. He read it twice and smiled faintly. For the first time in weeks, something good had found its way to him. Someone out there remembered, even if they didn't say who they were. He folded the note carefully and placed it inside the old box with his service papers. That simple gesture reminded him that not everyone saw him as a stranger. A few days later, he went into town to buy dog food and some supplies. The air felt lighter somehow. The shopkeeper greeted him warmly again, and a few locals nodded at him with polite smiles. Word must have spread that the sheriff had cleared his name. As he left the store, one of the officers who had visited his cabin before approached him. "Sir," the young man said awkwardly, "I wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding. We didn't know who you were. The sheriff filled us in later." Mark studied his face for a moment. He saw genuine regret there. "It's all right," he said finally. "You were doing your job. Just be careful how you see people. Not everything is what it looks like." The officer nodded gratefully. "Yes, sir." Back at the cabin, the forest looked brighter than usual. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting gold across the clearing. It was one of those rare days that felt perfectly balanced, quiet, calm, and whole. Mark worked in the garden while Rex lay in the shade. The dog had grown older, his fur slightly grayer around the muzzle, but his spirit was still strong. Every now and then he'd look up at Mark, tail wagging lazily. "Not bad, huh?" Mark said, glancing at the freshly planted rose. "We're getting good at this." Rex thumped his tail in response. As the afternoon faded, he brewed a pot of coffee and sat on the porch. The quiet wrapped around him like a soft blanket. After so much tension, the peace felt deeper than before, earned, not borrowed. But peace has a way of being temporary. That same week, a reporter came to town. She had been covering stories about veterans living in isolation, trying to highlight their struggles and resilience. Someone must have mentioned him to her because she asked around for directions to his cabin. When she arrived, Mark was splitting firewood. She introduced herself politely and explained her work. "I'm not here to pry," she said. "I just think people would be inspired to hear your story." Mark hesitated. He had spent years avoiding attention, yet something about her sincerity made him pause. Maybe sharing a piece of his life could help others understand what it meant to start over after war. He agreed to talk, as long as the focus stayed on the message, not on him personally. They sat on the porch while Rex rested at their feet. The conversation started slow but soon flowed naturally. He spoke about adjusting to civilian life, about finding peace in nature, about how companionship, especially from a loyal dog, could heal wounds no one else could see. The reporter listened carefully, writing notes but mostly letting him speak. When she left later that afternoon, she thanked him warmly. "I think your story might help a lot of people," she said. He nodded. "If it does, that's enough." Weeks passed and life carried on. Then one morning, while drinking his coffee, he saw the article online. It was beautifully written, respectful, honest, and heartfelt. The headline read, "The Quiet Veteran Who Found Peace in the Woods." It didn't mention his full name or exact location, but it painted a vivid picture of a man who had served with honor and now lived a simple, peaceful life. The story spread quickly across social media. Messages of gratitude poured into the newspaper's website. People from all over the country left comments thanking him for his service, admiring his strength, and sharing how the story had touched them. Mark read a few of the comments and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: connection. Not fame, not attention, but simple human understanding. In town, people began treating him differently. Strangers nodded with respect, not suspicion. The same officers who had once questioned him now greeted him with smiles. Even the local kids waved when he drove by. Rex became something of a local hero, too. The shopkeeper started keeping treats behind the counter just for him, calling him the bravest dog in the county. For the first time since he'd moved there, Mark felt like part of the community. The fear and doubt that once surrounded his name had turned into quiet admiration. But behind all the warmth, there was still one truth he couldn't ignore. Peace was never permanent. It was something you had to keep choosing every day, so he kept his routines. Early mornings by the river. Long walks through the forest. Evenings spent by the fire reflecting on how far he had come. Sometimes he received letters from strangers who had read the article. They shared their own struggles. Veterans, widows, people healing from loss. Many said they found comfort in his words about starting over. He wrote back to some of them offering simple advice. You don't have to forget the past to move forward. You just have to make peace with it. It wasn't poetry, but it was the truth. One afternoon, months after the story went viral, the sheriff stopped by his cabin. Just wanted to check in, he said, smiling. You've become quite the celebrity around here, Mark chuckled softly. That was never the plan, I figured, the sheriff said. Still, it's good to see something positive come out of all that mess. They talked for a while about the town, the new safety measures, and the way people had started volunteering to support local veterans. The change was small but real, and it filled the man with quiet pride. When the sheriff left, Mark sat on the porch again with Rex. The sun dipped low behind the hills, turning the sky orange. You see that, boy? He said softly. Sometimes good things grow out of mistakes. Rex wagged his tail gently, leaning against his leg. Life settled into a new kind of calm after that. He still kept to himself, but he wasn't invisible anymore. The townspeople had come to understand him, not through fear, but through respect. In the fall, the trees turned gold and red. The forest felt alive again, full of color and warmth. Mark spent his days preparing firewood for winter, cooking hearty meals and writing short notes in a journal he'd started keeping. The entries weren't long, just reflections about gratitude, purpose, and peace. One evening, he looked through that journal and realized something important. The man he used to be, the soldier who lived in shadows, had finally found light again. Not because the world had changed, but because he had chosen to open up, even just a little. That night he sat outside under the stars. Rex lay beside him, breathing softly. The air was cool, the river glimmering under the moon. He thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the misunderstanding, the long road back to acceptance. And in that moment he felt something deep and unshakable. Peace, not just in his surroundings, but within himself. He took a slow breath, the kind that fills your lungs and clears your mind. For the first time in years, there was no weight pressing on his chest. He looked down at his loyal friend. We made it, didn't we? He whispered. Rex lifted his head, eyes shining in the dim light. The man smiled. Yeah, we did. In the distance, the faint sound of an owl echoed through the forest. The night wrapped around them softly, gentle and alive. There were no sirens, no rumors, no fear. Only the steady heartbeat of the land he had chosen to call home. And though he didn't know what the future would bring, he finally understood something he hadn't before. That peace wasn't a place or a reward. It was a choice, one he could keep making every single day. He stood, stretched his back, and looked toward the river. Tomorrow would come with its own set of moments, some quiet, some challenging. But whatever they brought, he and Rex would face them together, as they always had. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the smell of pine and earth. The stars above seemed brighter than usual, scattered like memories across the dark sky. As he turned to go inside, he took one last look at the woods around him, the same woods that had once been filled with suspicion and now stood as a symbol of new beginnings. He smiled to himself. For a man who had lived a life of war, there was no greater victory than peace. And with that thought, he stepped inside, closed the door gently, and let the quiet night hold him in its arms.